Hi, this is Matt Finch, and this is part 4 of the videos about using the Open Game License and what the Open Game License is. In this one, we're going to cover sections 9 through 15 of the OGL. We're doing the walkthrough of the different sections of it. We'll start with section 9, updating the license. All that this one says is that you can basically use any authorized version of the OGL to work with open game content, and so that simply means that there may be later versions of the license, but you can use whichever one you choose to put into play. We'll move on to section 10, since section 9 is important, but it's not going to be relevant to most people who are watching this video. In section 10 is talking about the copy of the license, and this one is a vital provision because you're going to find in pretty much any open game content work that you see, you're going to see the duplicate of the license reproduced there in the legal appendix, and it is a requirement that you include the full text of the license, and that you not change anything inside the license except for updating the copyright information in section 15. So copy of the license there. Moving on to section 11, use of contributor credits. The text of this is use of contributor credits. You may not market or advertise the open game content using the name of any contributor unless you have written permission from the contributor to do so. And so all that means is that, for example, say that you're incorporating some content, say by me, okay, you're incorporating some content that I've written. What that means is you can't advertise your work saying, and Matt Finch is a contributor to this, because it wasn't something that I was directly contributing to. I just created the open game content that you're then using. So basically, it just means that you can't advertise your work based on the fact that you're using open game content that someone generally released out into the wild. You can't go ahead and use their name on it. Section 12 is possibly a very important provision. It serves really as a reminder that just look, regardless of what you want to do, if you can't meet the terms of this contract, you don't get to use the contract. And that's just period, paragraph, and I think it's probably fairly obvious to people who are thinking about this in terms of the way that it ought to operate, but the human tendency on almost everything is to think, well, you're letting me do this stuff, I just have this little need, let me go ahead and put that in there. And this is the provision that says, no, you can't do that. If you really can't produce your product under the terms of the open game license, then you've just got to suck it up and move on. So that's section 13. Sorry, that's section 12. Moving on to section 13, this is sort of a trouble provision. This is the one where, and I'll read it, it's termination. This license will terminate automatically if you fail to comply with all the terms herein and fail to cure such breach within 30 days of becoming aware of the breach. All sublicenses shall survive the termination of this license. Now, what that means is that if you do something that is wrong under this license, first of all, you have a 30 days grace period to fix it, so that it's not a sort of thing where there's suddenly a nuclear strike against you if you make an honest mistake and don't try and fix it. But what it does is it will, if you cannot use the license, in other words, if the license agreement is terminated, that means that you cannot continue publishing what it is that you've done. So it's an important provision if you have breached the terms of the OGL. Once again, since we're looking at this probably from the first step standpoint of somebody who wants to do something in the OGL, this provision is not something, hopefully what you're trying to do is comply with the OGL, not to have to worry about how the termination provision works and what the ramifications of the termination provision would be. Then we move on to section 14, which is called Reformation, and the text is, if any provision of this license is held to be unenforceable, such provision shall be reformed only to the extent necessary to make it enforceable. That's legal boilerplate, and what it addresses is the fact that in some courts, if there is a provision that is considered to be overreaching or impermissible in some way, that what the court is supposed to do under that jurisdiction's law is simply remove it entirely from a contract. This protects against a court doing that, because in the terms of the contract, it says what the court needs to do is simply say what it is that would be permissible, and then that's what is done there, and that avoids having a bizarre gap in the logic of a contract that's set up by the way that some jurisdictions interpret contract law. So you really don't need to worry about Section 14 when you're looking at this from the starting point of publishing. That is something that would only kick in if there were an actual lawsuit going on, really. Finally, we get to Section 15, copyright notice, and now we're back in the realm of things that are going to be important for people who are trying to come up with a work from the front end. What this one requires you to do, now we've already seen the fact that you have to include the copy of the license and that you have to update Section 15. And so what this provision does is this one is not a provision of the contract that is operative. What this is basically simply a chain of title that's in here on the list of copyrights that have been used. So this is the one part of the license where you will actually be changing, you'll be changing what's in there. Actually, you won't really be changing it, but you'll be adding to it. It gives you the initial starting copyright notice for the rules that you are using. And this is different between two different versions of the OGL, because if you're using the one back in 3rd edition days, you're making a reference to the 3rd edition rules, and if you're using the one that is now out there for the 5th edition rules, you're using the SRD description for the 5th edition rules. If it turns out that you are using stuff from both, you will need to include both. So take a look at the copyright data on the other SRD if you are using two of them, and include them both. That's not I would do that. That's safe practice if you're using both of them. Now that we'll talk a bit more about what all of these things look like once they're put together in a legal appendix at the end of your resource that you're publishing. There's a bit more obviously to Section 15, but we'll talk through that in the next video about how to do it, because we've really finished talking about all the operative contract terms that are in here, and now we're just going to move to what this is going to look like once it's all finished, and then you can go back and if there's a question, you can check the operative terms and see how those would work. So with that, we're going to move on to what I believe is going to be the last video in the series. Thanks very much for watching. Imagine the hell out of it.